"Who the hell let the cleaning staff into the executive suite?" The words, sharp as shattered glass, echoed across the silent, cavernous boardroom. Sterling Rhodes IV, heir to a century of Chicago steel and silicon, let the question hang in the air, a deliberate poison. His eyes, the pale predatory blue of a winter sky over Lake Michigan, held a practiced theatrical cruelty. A slow, deliberate tilt of his hand sent a cascade of 25-year-old Pappy Van Winkle splashing across the front of Alani Thompson's custom-tailored silk blouse. The amber liquid, worth more than most people's monthly paychecks, soaked into the pristine black fabric, a dark, spreading stain of contempt. "Oops," he murmured, the word drawing a series of sycophantic, rumbling chuckles from the dozen men and one other woman seated around the monolithic obsidian table. "But what do you think? Was that really an accident, or was it a declaration of war? Let me know what you believe in the comments below. And while you're there, go ahead and smash that like button and subscribe to this channel, because you are about to witness a masterclass in revenge, and trust me, you won't want to miss a single glorious second." Alani's jaw tightened, a barely perceptible clench of muscle that was the only outward sign of the inferno raging within her. Her knuckles, wrapped around the handle of her sleek carbon fiber briefcase, turned a shade lighter. Her gaze remained locked on Sterling, unwavering, unblinking, an unreadable depth in her dark eyes. Slowly, with the grace of a panther, her fingers moved to the lapel of her blazer, where a small, exquisitely crafted silver pin in the shape of a nightingale rested. She pressed a nearly invisible indentation on its wing. Click. The sound was infinitesimal, yet it sliced through the privileged, self-satisfied laughter like a guillotine. The boardroom froze. Garrett Vance, the company's CFO, suspended a cup of ridiculously expensive coffee halfway to his lips. A whisper started at the far end of the table. Did she just... But it died in the throat as Alani's shoulders straightened, her spine becoming a rod of pure steel. Her chin lifted, her expression one of dangerous, absolute calm. They thought this was their arena, their game. They had no idea they were merely actors in a play she had written 3 years ago. The head of security, a burly man whose suit couldn't quite conceal the Glock on his hip, let his hand drift instinctively towards his radio. But he hesitated as she began to walk. Not towards the service exit they clearly expected, but towards Sterling Rhodes IV's private, gilded elevator. The rhythmic click-clack of her Christian Louboutin heels against the imported Italian marble floor was the only sound in the vast room. It sounded like a countdown. No one moved. No one dared to breathe. The golden elevator doors, etched with the Rhodes family crest, whispered shut, sealing her inside. Alani stared at her reflection in the polished brass. The dark stain of the whiskey was a blemish on her perfect armor. But she wasn't scowling. She wasn't angry. She was smiling. It was a terrifying smile, the kind that doesn't promise forgiveness, but consequences. The kind of smile that promises empires will fall. Her watch, a simple, elegant piece, displayed the time. Her silver nightingale pin had just transmitted 4 minutes and 17 seconds of crystal-clear audio, including the clink of the glass and the subsequent laughter, to a secure server located in a bunker 3 states away. The countdown had begun, and Sterling Rhodes IV, floating on an ocean of inherited arrogance, had no conceivable idea that justice, with interest compounded over decades, was about to collect its debt. The executive elevator ascended 80 floors in a profound, pressurized silence. But in Alani's mind, she was traveling much, much further. Back to the hallowed, ivy-covered halls of the University of Chicago Booth School of Business, where she had graduated not just as valedictorian, but with a thesis on hostile takeovers that her professors still used as a case study. back to the cramped two-bedroom apartment in Pilsen, where she had held her father's hand, watching the life drain out of him, his great heart finally giving out under the crushing weight of a dream that had been stolen from him. Back to the precise moment, 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days ago, when Rhodes Legacy Holdings, over-leveraged and teetering on the brink of a catastrophic bankruptcy, had been saved by a mysterious, last-minute infusion of capital from an offshore investment firm named Apex Innovations, a 38% acquisition, a controlling interest. They never even bothered to look into who was behind the name. Old money, she mused, rarely looks beyond its own reflection. They never saw her coming. "Are you here to interview for the janitorial position?" The voice, sharp and laced with bored condescension, sliced through her reverie. The elevator doors had opened onto the executive lobby, a sterile expanse of white marble and glass that felt less like an office and more like a mausoleum for ambition. The receptionist, a young blonde woman whose nameplate read Tiffany, didn't bother to look up from her TikTok feed, her impossibly long, manicured nails clicking against her phone screen with the casual rhythm of ingrained assumptions. Behind her, a gallery of oil paintings depicted generations of dead, white Rhodes men, their stern, humorless faces glaring down from ornate, gilded frames. Their painted eyes seemed to follow Alani's every move, a silent, ancestral security system designed to intimidate and exclude. "Ma'am, the service elevator is down the hall to the left," the security guard's voice boomed, layered with that particular brand of forced politeness that is somehow more insulting than outright hostility. His hand rested on his radio, his fingers twitching, a man itching for a reason to exert the small amount of power he possessed. But something in Alani's posture, in the sheer, unadulterated confidence with which she continued toward the main conference room without so much as a glance in his direction, made him pause. His hand dropped from the radio. Inside the boardroom, Sterling Rhodes III, the ancient patriarch of the family, the man whose portrait was the largest and most imposing in the corporate ghost gallery, extended a liver-spotted hand without bothering to rise from his throne-like leather chair. "Ah, yes. Sarah, is it? Or perhaps Sabrina?" His voice was a dry, reptilian rasp, the sound of a man who had spent 85 years of his life never needing to remember the name of anyone he considered insignificant. "We are just so very grateful for the company's diversity and inclusion initiative. It brings us such enthusiastic new faces." Garrett Vance, the CFO, let out a wheezing chuckle from his seat at the obsidian table. His UChicago MBA pin gleamed on his lapel like a tiny, self-important shield. Now, Sterling, let's not overwhelm her. I'm sure the DEI team prepped her adequately, though perhaps we should stick to the simpler concepts today. He slid a single sheet of paper across the vast, polished surface. It was a page of quarterly projections, but it had been deliberately simplified. The numbers rounded, the complex financial terminology replaced with concepts a child could understand. It was an insult crafted by a committee. "Let someone with actual experience handle the granular data," added Eleanor Vance, the head of the legal department and Garrett's older sister. Her silver hair was pulled back into a bun so severe it looked like it could be weaponized. Her smile could freeze the whiskey that was still drying on Alani's blouse. "We wouldn't want any confusion about our core business model, sweetie." But Alani wasn't listening to their condescension. Not really. She was observing, documenting. Beneath the table, hidden from their sight, her fingers moved with silent, methodical precision across the screen of her encrypted phone. Each dismissive glance, each mispronounced name, each patronizing assumption was being logged, time-stamped, and categorized. Every microaggression was becoming a data point. Every insult was becoming evidence in a case they didn't even know they were building against themselves. From across the room, a pair of eyes met hers. Maria Flores, a mid-level operations manager who had been brought in to deliver coffee, was watching the exchange with a look of profound discomfort. Her face was flushed with a mixture of second-hand embarrassment and something far deeper. It was recognition. It was the memory of her own battles, fought in smaller rooms for smaller stakes against the same suffocating arrogance. When their gazes locked, Maria's hand moved, an almost imperceptible motion, toward the worn leather purse at her feet. Inside that purse, a single USB drive waited, a small plastic rectangle that held the digital equivalent of a stick of dynamite. Alani's phone vibrated silently with an incoming message. It was from Damian Cross, her legal partner, a former federal prosecutor whose downtown Chicago office overlooked Millennium Park from 50 floors up. Legal team is on standby. The clock starts now. 72 hours. The words appeared on the screen and vanished a second later, but their meaning burned itself into Alani's memory. Why don't we begin with a basic overview of market analytics? Sterling Rhodes IV interjected, his voice dripping with the kind of exaggerated patience one uses with a pet or a particularly slow-witted child. I'm sure you'll find it educational. The PowerPoint presentation began. Each slide was a masterclass in corporate gaslighting, a symphony of institutional deceit. Market share projections that defied basic mathematics, profit margins that seemed to exist in a dimension free from the laws of accounting, patent portfolios that conveniently omitted the most valuable intellectual property that had been developed and patented by Apex Innovations. But Alani didn't interrupt. She didn't correct their fabricated numbers. She didn't reveal the fact that she knew their balance sheets more intimately than they did. Instead, she watched. She waited. Her nightingale pin recorded every lie, while her adversaries dug their own graves, one condescending word at a time. They thought they were schooling the help. They had no idea she was composing their eulogy. The presentation clicked to slide number 17, and Sterling Ford's voice adopted the patronizing tone of a prep school headmaster explaining long division to a student on a scholarship. Now, I know some of these technical terms can be a little overwhelming, he said, circling a meaningless, brightly colored pie chart with his laser pointer. But just try your best to follow along. The real numbers, the ones that mattered, remained carefully hidden, tucked away behind a labyrinth of corporate smoke and mirrors. Garrett Vance leaned forward, his enthusiasm grotesquely paternalistic. You see, sweetie, he began, as if explaining gravity to a toddler, when we talk about our intellectual property portfolio, we're referring to patents. These patents generate revenue streams for the company. Think of it like a cookbook, but instead of recipes for cakes, it's recipes for making money. His condescension was a thick, poisonous syrup. Each word was carefully chosen to diminish, to belittle, to put her in her place. But Alani had already seen the real recipes. She'd seen them in encrypted files delivered by whistleblowers, in late-night data dumps from anonymous sources. She'd seen the real numbers, the ones hidden in offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, disguised as exorbitant consulting fees, laundered through a web of subsidiary corporations that existed only as digital letterheads on a server in Panama. She knew about the $5.3 billion in patent theft from Apex Innovations' R&D labs. She knew about the 62 unreported, life-threatening safety violations at the Joliet manufacturing plant. She knew about the systematic wage suppression, a carefully orchestrated scheme affecting over 5,000 employees across 3 states. Her fingers moved silently under the table, cross-referencing each lie they told with the mountain of photographic evidence, internal memos, and audio recordings that would prove utterly devastating in federal court. Perhaps we should take a short break, Eleanor Vance suggested, her smile as sharp and cold as a shard of ice. Give our guest A moment to absorb all this complex information. The word guest was delivered with surgical precision, a verbal scalpel intended to remind everyone in the room exactly where they believed Alani belonged in their carefully constructed hierarchy. Sterling Rhodes III, the old patriarch, let his weathered face crease into something that might have passed for a grin. "An excellent idea, Eleanor." "Maria," he barked, not even looking at her, "why don't you give our visitor a nice tour? Show her the employee cafeteria, perhaps the gift shop. You know, somewhere more appropriate to her interests." The laughter that followed was uglier than the words themselves. It was the easy, cruel laughter of a dozen men in $1,000 suits, finding genuine, unadulterated amusement in their own barbarism. But Maria Flores did not laugh. Instead, she stood up with the careful, deliberate grace of someone who has spent a lifetime navigating minefields disguised as office spaces. "Of course, Mr. Rhodes. I would be happy to show Ms. Thompson around." The emphasis she placed on Ms. was subtle, but it was a clear and defiant act of rebellion that did not go unnoticed. "That's so thoughtful of you, Maria," Eleanor Vance purred, her voice laced with the particular brand of venom reserved for women who dare to show solidarity across class and racial lines. "I'm sure you two will have so much in common to discuss." As they exited the boardroom, leaving the hyenas to their laughter, Maria's hand brushed against Alani's with deliberate, unmistakable intent. The transfer was seamless. The small USB drive, warm from her nervous grip, passed from her hand to Alani's, a small piece of digital dynamite that contained enough explosive evidence to bring down an empire. "Safety violations," Maria whispered, her voice barely audible above the echo of their footsteps in the marble hallway. "The Joliet plant. 15 workers were hospitalized last month with chemical burns. Garrett Vance's accounting team buried it, classified the medical reports as a minor workplace incident." The doors of the main elevator closed, sealing them in a capsule of gilded conspiracy. Maria's professional mask finally crumbled, revealing the years of accumulated rage beneath. "They did the same thing to me when I first started 5 years ago," she said, her dark eyes burning with a fire that had been banked for too long. "Different boardroom, same script, same condescending bastards." Her gaze fell upon Alani, a mixture of fear and a dangerous, burgeoning hope. "But you're not like the others they've tried to push out, are you?" Alani's silver nightingale pin gleamed in the elevator's soft, golden light. She checked the time on her watch. "No, Maria," she said, her voice carrying the quiet, unshakable authority of someone who has spent years preparing for this exact moment. "I'm not. In fact, I think it's time they learned exactly who they've been dealing with." Back in the boardroom, Sterling Rhodes IV was already on his private, encrypted phone, his fingers flying across the screen as he composed a message to Senator Michelson, the same corrupt senator whose smiling photograph hung behind the head of the table, his arm draped chummily around Sterling Rhodes III at some exclusive fundraising gala. "We may need to apply some legislative pressure to our little diversity problem," he dictated to his voice-to-text assistant. Nothing illegal, of course. Just some strategic complications to remind certain people of their place in the world. Garrett Vance nodded enthusiastically, already performing a mental cost-benefit analysis of destroying a woman's reputation versus the potential legal exposure. "I have some old friends at the SEC," he chimed in. "They might be very interested in conducting a very, very thorough audit of Apex Innovations. It's amazing how many accounting violations you can find when you're properly motivated to look." Eleanor Vance's manicured fingers drummed a rhythm against the obsidian table, a sound like a distant funeral march. "And there's always the patent litigation route," she added coolly. "We have enough lawyers on retainer to bury her in discovery paperwork for the next 2 decades. She'll be bankrupt before she ever sees the inside of a courtroom." But none of them noticed the tiny pinprick of red light still blinking on the base of Alani's abandoned water glass, a seemingly innocent piece of high-tech surveillance that was recording every word, every boast, every casual admission of criminal intent. The Nightingale pin wasn't just a recorder, it was a command and control unit for a network of listening devices, and they had just provided more than enough evidence to ensure their own spectacular destruction. 50 floors below, in his own gleaming office, Damian Cross received a notification on his encrypted laptop. The message was simple. Phase 1. Overture complete. Commence Phase 2. Crescendo. The timer on his screen now read 71 hours, 58 minutes, and counting. The Rhodes Empire, a fortress of privilege built over a century, had no idea that its very foundations were already crumbling beneath their handmade Italian leather shoes. Wednesday, 4:30 p.m., the message blazed across Damian Cross's encrypted monitor with the undeniable finality of a judge's gavel. Crescendo is live. Target ETA, Friday, 2 p.m. Sing Nightingale. 72 hours. It was a ridiculously short amount of time to dismantle an empire built on a century of corrupt handshakes and protected by layers of legal and political immunity that only vast generational wealth can buy. But Damian had been preparing for this very moment since the day Alani Thompson had walked into his office 3 years prior, spreading her father's stolen patent filings and falsified medical records across his desk like evidence in a cold-blooded murder trial. Confirmed. Legal framework is locked and loaded, he typed back, his fingers moving with a calm, steady precision that belied the sheer magnitude of the operation they were about to unleash. His cursor hovered for a second before he clicked the name Marcus Thorne. Judge Marcus Thorne, retired from the federal bench, a former Attorney General of the United States, and currently the most feared white-collar defense attorney in the country. He was the only man in America with enough raw gravitas to make the Securities and Exchange Commission, the FBI, and the Department of Justice move at the speed of light. The War Room, a secure, soundproofed suite of offices in the heart of downtown Chicago, assembled with the swift, silent efficiency of a special forces unit. Maria Flores, safely ensconced in a conference room with a direct, encrypted line, began uploading terabytes of data to a series of secure cloud servers. Her hands trembled slightly as she watched 5 years of meticulously documented evidence, a secret crusade she had waged in silence, stream across the fiber optic cables like a torrent of digital justice. There were the falsified safety violation reports that Garrett Vance's accounting team had buried under layers of fraudulent shell company invoices. There were email chains where Sterling Rhodes IV joked with his cronies about teaching the help their place. There were secret audio recordings from past meetings, captured on her own phone, where human lives and crippling injuries were dismissed as acceptable losses and manageable liabilities. Damian's forensics team, a collection of the best white-hat hackers and forensic accountants money could buy, worked through the night, their faces illuminated by the eerie glow of dozens of monitors. They were digital archaeologists, unearthing a lost city of corporate malfeasance. Every deleted email was recovered. Every hidden wire transfer was traced through a labyrinth of offshore banks. Every shell corporation was mapped, with the clinical precision of a surgeon dissecting a malignant tumor. The $88 million tax evasion scheme unfolded on their screens like a detailed roadmap to federal prison, each wire transfer and falsified invoice providing irrefutable, time-stamped evidence of criminal intent. Thursday morning broke over Chicago, the sun glinting off the steel and glass towers of the Loop, carrying the promise of a long-overdue reckoning. A flood of legal injunctions began to flow from Judge Thorne's prestigious law firm, a veritable tidal wave of legal force. Asset freezes, document preservation orders, emergency motions, all were filed simultaneously, landing on the desks of federal judges across the district before their morning coffee had even had a chance to cool. The formal SEC investigation request, penned by Thorne himself, carried the weight of a man who had once been the nation's chief law enforcement officer. It wasn't a request, it was a command. 15 workers hospitalized. Maria's voice crackled over the encrypted speakerphone in the war room. It was thick with emotion as she read from the original medical records, documents the road's corporate physicians had been ordered to alter and destroy. Severe chemical burns to the lungs and skin. Vance's team officially classified it as a seasonal flu outbreak to avoid having to file a report with OSHA and pay the fines. Each word she spoke was another nail being hammered into the coffin the Rhodes family had unknowingly built for themselves, one monstrous lie at a time. But 80 floors above the city, in his marble-clad sanctuary, Sterling Rhodes IV remained blissfully, arrogantly unaware that his world was being systematically dismantled in real time. He leaned back in his leather throne, a smug smile on his face as he dictated another message to Senator Michelson. The diversity problem is proving more persistent than anticipated, he typed. May require some more creative, off-the-book solutions to remind certain people of their place in the natural order of things. The senator's reply was almost instantaneous. Legislative options are always on the table. Committee assignments can be very flexible. Let's discuss the details over a round of golf this weekend at the club. Garrett Vance strode into the boardroom with the self-satisfied swagger of a man who had just successfully calculated the precise cost-benefit analysis of destroying a human life. My contacts at the SEC are confirmed, he announced, beaming. They are extremely interested in conducting a comprehensive, top-to-bottom audit of Apex Innovations. It's truly amazing how many regulatory violations can suddenly surface when you know exactly where to look. His UChicago MBA pin caught a ray of morning sunlight, glinting like a tiny, sharpened sword, polished and ready for a corporate bloodletting. Eleanor Vance's perfectly manicured fingers tapped out a silent, rhythmic beat on the obsidian table, a death march in miniature. The patent litigation team is on full standby, she reported. We can bury her in legal fees for the next 2 decades. The discovery process alone will cost her tens of millions. She'll be ruined. Her smile could have frozen champagne at room temperature, but none of them noticed the tiny red light, still blinking patiently on the base of Alani's water glass. Nor did they have any idea that their voices, carried through the building's sophisticated ventilation system, were being picked up by a series of strategically placed recording devices that Damien's team had installed weeks ago, disguised as smoke detectors during a routine, scheduled maintenance visit. Every casual admission of their criminal conspiracy, every arrogant boast, was being captured in crystal-clear digital audio, time-stamped, and encrypted with military-grade security protocols. A flicker of doubt, a momentary crack in his armor of arrogance, crossed Sterling IV's face. It was the first time in his life he had ever questioned himself. Did we perhaps go too far with the cleaning staff comment? The question hung in the rarefied air for exactly 3 seconds before Garrett Vance's dismissive laugh cut through the tension like a scalpel. Don't be ridiculous, Sterling. She's just another entitled affirmative action hire playing the victim card. We own this company. We own this building. We own half the judges in the Southern District of New York. What's she going to do? Sue us? The laughter that erupted around the table was deep and heartfelt. It was the laughter of untouchable men. It was laughter that would sound particularly exquisitely hollow when played back to a jury in federal court. Thursday night, the media dossiers compiled themselves with terrifying algorithmic precision. Seasoned financial reporters at the Wall Street Journal and the Chicago Tribune received anonymous encrypted emails containing tips backed by a mountain of irrefutable forensic accounting evidence. Investigative journalists at ProPublica found unmarked USB drives in their mailboxes containing audio files and internal corporate documents that read like a step-by-step manual for institutional racism and criminal negligence. Civil rights attorneys at the ACLU and the NAACP from Chicago to Washington, D.C. Ours woke up to find their inboxes filled with enough evidence to fuel a generation of class action lawsuits. Damian Cross's phone buzzed with a relentless stream of updates. Asset tracking complete. All offshore accounts located and frozen. Criminal referrals filed with the DOJ. Congressional inquiry initiated by the House Oversight Committee. International banking cooperation secured via Judge Thorne's contacts at Interpol. Each notification was a death knell, bringing the Rhodes Empire one step closer to absolute, irreversible collapse. Their foundations, which they believed to be solid rock, were being eroded by the very systems of power they thought would protect them forever. Friday morning, 6 a.m. Maria Flores sat in her small apartment in the Logan Square neighborhood, a cup of coffee growing cold in her hands as she watched the sun rise over the city skyline. The world outside her window looked the same as it had yesterday, but she knew it was a profoundly different place. In exactly 8 hours, she would walk back into that marble mausoleum, not as an invisible, mid-level functionary, but as the incoming chief executive officer of Rhodes Legacy Holdings. In 8 hours, she would deliver justice, not just for herself, but for the 15 men still recovering from their injuries, and for every single worker who had ever suffered in silence, while the rich men in the boardroom above counted their profits. The official notice for an emergency board meeting went out with exactly 48 hours advance notice, legally sufficient, but strategically devastating. Sterling Rhodes IV received the notification on his phone while sipping a $200 cup of coffee, completely oblivious to the fact that he was about to become the star character in the most expensive and public lesson about consequences ever taught in the history of American corporate governance. Damian Cross checked his own watch. It was a simple, functional Timex, a watch that kept perfect time without needing precious metals or flashy status symbols. Phase 3. Finale initiated, he messaged Alani. Target confirmed. Friday, 2 p.m. Justice is incoming. The countdown had reached its final, critical hours. And somewhere in a quiet suite at the Peninsula Hotel, overlooking the magnificent Mile, Alani Thompson was preparing to teach the Rhodes family and the entire world what real power looks like when it's wielded not by those who inherit it, but by those who have truly, painstakingly earned it. Friday, 2:00 p.m. The great carved mahogany doors to the boardroom swung open with the silent, inexorable weight of destiny. Alani Thompson entered. She was not the humiliated victim from Wednesday afternoon. She was not the diversity hire they had sought to put in her place. She was something far more terrifying to them. A woman who had spent the last 72 hours and the last 3 years systematically dismantling the very foundations of everything the Rhodes family believed to be eternal and unshakable. Behind her, Damian Cross moved with the predatory, coiled grace of a federal prosecutor who had never lost a single case. He was flanked by a team of 3 other attorneys from his firm, men and women whose combined resumes read like a Supreme Court nomination wish list. But it was the 4th figure in their entourage, a man who moved with a quiet, profound authority that caused the blood to drain from Sterling Rhodes IV's face. A sudden, shocking pallor like champagne spilled on a white marble floor. Judge Marcus Thorne, the former Attorney General of the United States. The man whose signature appeared on more high-profile criminal indictments of powerful men than any prosecutor in modern American history. He settled into a chair at the obsidian table with the calm, dispassionate air of someone who had brought down presidents and prime ministers with the same methodical efficiency. "Allow me to properly introduce myself." Alani's voice cut through the stunned marble silence. It was a voice of surgical precision, each word weighted with 3 years of meticulous, obsessive preparation. "I am Alani Thompson. I am the founder and chief executive officer of Apex Innovations, and as of 3 years ago, I am also the controlling shareholder of 38% of Rhodes Legacy Holdings, which my firm acquired during your family's rather unfortunate and nearly catastrophic financial crisis. The silence that followed was not merely an absence of noise, it was a physical presence, a crushing weight, the kind of profound, absolute silence that precedes an avalanche or a nuclear detonation. Sterling Ford's face cycled through a rapid, spastic series of emotions: utter confusion, dawning recognition, sputtering disbelief, and finally, the pure, abject horror of a man who suddenly realizes he has been arrogantly playing checkers while his opponent has been orchestrating a game of three-dimensional global chess. That's impossible, Garrett Vance stammered, his voice a pathetic whisper. His precious UChicago MBA pin suddenly looked like a cheap child's toy in a room full of weapons-grade intellects. We have majority control. The board structure, the bylaws. The board structure, Damian Cross interrupted, his smile as cold and sharp as liquid nitrogen, is about to undergo some rather dramatic changes. He placed a thick, leather-bound portfolio on the obsidian table, with the quiet reverence of a priest handling a sacred relic. Ladies and gentlemen of the board, he announced to the room, I present to you comprehensive, irrefutable documentation of criminal conspiracy, racketeering, massive tax evasion, felony patent theft, dozens of OSHA violations resulting in grievous bodily harm, and a pattern of systematic civil rights violations spanning the last 7 years. A series of USB drives appeared on the table, laid out like digital dominoes, ready to fall. Each one contained enough evidence to utterly destroy a career, a reputation, and a legacy that had been built on generations of carefully curated, fiercely protected privilege. And then, a new figure stepped forward. Maria Flores. She was no longer the frightened, invisible middle manager who served coffee to men who never bothered to learn her name. She slid the drives across the polished wood, one by one, to the assembled board members, her movements filled with the newfound confidence of someone who has finally, after years of silence, found their voice. Felony safety violations at the Joliet manufacturing plant, she announced, her voice clear and strong, carrying the weight of the 15 hospitalized workers whose agony had been reduced to a mere line item on Garrett Vance's quarterly reports. Theft of intellectual property totaling $5.3 billion, stolen directly from Apex Innovations' research and development labs. Tax evasion, facilitated through a network of offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands, amounting to $88 million over the last 3 fiscal years. The moment of full, horrific realization finally struck Sterling Rhodes' Totor like a physical blow, a freight train loaded with consequences. This was all a setup, he choked out, his voice cracking like his great-grandmother's antique china hitting the marble floor. The entitlement of a lifetime, the arrogance of 4 generations, dissolved into the terrified, pathetic whimper of a man who, for the first time, understood that actions have consequences, even for people like him. You planned this, Sterling, Alani responded, her tone as cold and precise as a surgeon's scalpel removing a malignant tumor. Every racist comment you made, every casual, dismissive insult, every single moment that you and your executive team treated human beings as expendable assets in your personal, pathetic board game, I didn't plan it. I simply responded appropriately. Eleanor Vance's carefully constructed facade of manicured, iron-willed control crumbled like ancient parchment exposed to the sun. But Senator Michelson, she sputtered, her words trailing off as Damian produced a tablet and slid it in front of her. Displayed on the screen were federal arrest warrants, her own name printed in the stark official font of the United States government. Our legal protections, the immunity guarantees. Senator Michelson. Judge Thorne spoke for the very first time, his voice carrying the immense gravitas of a man who had once held the nation's highest law enforcement office, is, at this very moment, explaining his long and lucrative relationship with this organization to a federal grand jury. His cooperation, I must say, has been illuminating. The vote began. It proceeded with the mechanical, inexorable precision of a Swiss timepiece. Board members who had spent decades kissing the ring of the Rhodes dynasty, protecting the family's interests above all else, suddenly discovered urgent, compelling reasons to distance themselves from a ship that was not just sinking, but plunging into the abyss. Alani's 38% controlling interest suddenly became 47% as the first wave of allies abandoned their posts. 47% became 62% as the raw, primal instinct for survival overrode decades of loyalty. 62% became a staggering 89% as the final, terrified holdouts realized that their only path forward was to side with the future, not the toxic, criminal past. Motion to remove the Rhodes family and their appointed executives from all corporate positions, effective immediately, Damien announced, his voice carrying the somber finality of a funeral director. All in favor. Hands shot up around the table like a forest of white flags of surrender. Sterling Rhodes IV stared at the unanimous vote with the vacant, uncomprehending expression of a man watching his own public execution. His pale blue eyes reflected the cold, fluorescent lights of the boardroom like ice on the verge of shattering. Motion to install Ms. Maria Flores as Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately. More hands. More surrender. More justice, served cold and at room temperature, in a marble mausoleum that now reeked of old money and even older sins. Sterling Defoe's final words were a pathetic gasp, the last rattle of a dying dynasty, choked with a generational entitlement that was collapsing under its own immense moral bankruptcy. "You have no idea what you've done," he whispered hoarsely. "The connections we have, the power structures we control." "Had," Alani corrected him, and for the first time, a genuine smile touched her lips. It was a smile that could melt steel or freeze the stars, depending entirely on which side of history you were standing on. "Past tense, Sterling. You had power. Now, what you have are federal charges, frozen assets, and approximately 48 hours before your mugshot appears on the front page of every major newspaper in America." The gavel fell, metaphorically, of course, since corporate boardrooms don't actually use gavels. And with that silent fall, an empire built on privilege, protected by corruption, and sustained by the vile, unspoken belief that some people are simply too rich and too powerful to ever face consequences, finally came to an end. Maria Flores rose from her chair. She was no longer a victim. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer silent. "My first act as CEO," she announced, her voice carrying across the marble walls that had never before heard words like these, "will be to establish a $50 million fund for worker safety improvements and full compensation for all victims of this company's negligence. My second act," she continued, her voice growing stronger, "will be to implement a mandatory 40% diversity requirement for all leadership positions, effective today." The transformation was complete. The system hadn't just been challenged. It had been systematically and brilliantly dismantled, and then rebuilt from the ground up, with justice as its new, unshakable cornerstone. Outside the 80th floor windows, the city of Chicago continued its relentless, beautiful march toward tomorrow, completely unaware that history had just been rewritten in a boardroom where whiskey once stained a silk blouse and racist slurs once echoed off cold, unforgiving marble walls. The perp walk began at precisely 4:47 p.m. Federal agents escorted Sterling Rhodes IV, his hands cuffed behind his back, through the very same marble lobby of his family's tower, where he had deliberately humiliated Alani Thompson just 72 hours earlier. The whiskey stain on her blouse had long since been professionally cleaned, but the stain on his family's legacy would follow him to federal prison and haunt his name for generations to come. A horde of photographers captured every ignominious step of his descent, from corporate royalty to federal defendant, their cameras clicking like 1,000 digital typewriters, all composing the final, damning obituary of old money privilege. Bradley Morrison's UChicago MBA pin gleamed one last time under the harsh, unforgiving fluorescent lights of the federal courthouse as a pair of cold steel handcuffs replaced his platinum cufflinks. The man who had once callously dismissed human suffering and crippling injuries as acceptable losses now faced 18 months in a minimum security prison and was ordered to pay $5.3 million in personal fines, a number that, by some poetic coincidence, exactly matched the value of the patents his accounting team had helped steal from Apex Innovations. Victoria Sterling's silver hair, once pulled back into a bun so tight it could cut glass, now hung limp and defeated around her shoulders as she signed the plea agreement that would keep her out of federal prison in exchange for her full and complete testimony against the now disgraced Senator Michelson. Her law license, which she had earned at Yale and polished in the corporate boardrooms of Chicago, vanished into the bureaucratic filing cabinets of the Illinois State Bar Association, along with her 7-figure salary and her corner office with its panoramic view of Lake Michigan. But it was the quiet, profound transformation of Maria Flores that truly rewrote the narrative of justice in America. 6 months after being dismissed as just another diversity hire, she stood behind the mahogany podium in the grand lobby of the newly renamed Apex Flores Tower. She was there to announce the company's revolutionary new commitment to worker safety, and she spoke with the unshakable authority of someone who has crawled through the burning wreckage of systemic oppression and emerged, not just intact, but stronger and more determined on the other side. Effective immediately, Maria's voice rang out, echoing through the marble lobby where the dour oil paintings of dead white men had been taken down and replaced by vibrant portraits of civil rights leaders, pioneering labor organizers, and the ordinary, hard-working men and women whose sweat and sacrifice had actually built the company from the ground up. Rhodes Legacy Holdings, now operating as Flores Industrial Solutions, will invest $50 million in comprehensive safety upgrades and technological overhauls across all of our manufacturing facilities. The check presentation ceremony took place in the very same boardroom where whiskey had once dripped from Italian wool. The families of the injured workers, men and women who had spent years fighting a losing battle against armies of corporate lawyers and intransigent insurance companies for basic medical coverage, received compensation that, for the first time, acknowledged their humanity instead of just calculating their suffering on a quarterly profit and loss statement. A woman named Sofia Rodriguez, whose husband had lost 3 fingers to a piece of faulty machinery that Garrett Vance's team knew was defective for over a year, held a check for $450,000 with hands that shook, not from anger or fear, but from the overwhelming, soul-deep relief of finally, after so long, being seen and being heard. The congressional hearing unfolded with the theatrical precision of a grand morality play, written and directed by the gods of justice themselves. Senator Michelson, stripped of his committee assignments and facing his own sprawling federal indictment, squirmed in his witness chair like a bug under a microscope as Judge Marcus Thorne read aloud, into the public record, the string of incriminating text messages that revealed a vast network of corruption spanning 3 decades and touching every level of government, from Chicago's City Hall all the way to the floor of the United States Senate. The American people deserve to know, Judge Thorne's voice thundered through the C-SPAN cameras, his words carried into millions of living rooms across the nation. How systemic racism and unchecked corporate greed conspired to deny justice to working families while protecting the privileged, powerful few who profited directly from their suffering. The ripple effects spread like a digital wildfire across social media and through the boardrooms of Chicago's financial district. Within 72 hours of Maria Flores's appointment as CEO, 12 other Fortune 500 companies headquartered in the city announced immediate, sweeping diversity and inclusion initiatives. The University of Chicago's Booth School of Business quickly added the Apex Flores case to its core curriculum as a mandatory study in corporate accountability, ethical leadership, and the catastrophic risks of institutional arrogance. But perhaps the most powerful and poignant transformation of all occurred in a small, quiet cemetery in Pilsen, where Alani Thompson knelt beside her father's simple granite headstone on a crisp, golden October morning, 6 months after the Rhodes Empire had crumbled into dust. The marble was still warm from the morning sun as she placed a bouquet of fresh flowers beside the small, folded American flag that recognized his service in Vietnam. A service that had meant absolutely nothing to the corporate executives who had stolen his life's work and destroyed his health with their discriminatory and predatory practices. "The system changed, Dad," she whispered to the unfeeling granite that bore his name, her voice carrying on the autumn breeze that rustled through the grass, still wet with morning dew. "We changed it, not just for me, and not just for you, but for everyone who comes after us. Maria's running the company now, and she's making sure that no worker ever has to suffer the way you did." The wind carried her words across the rows of headstones like a prayer, ascending to whatever heaven receives the souls of good men who died fighting injustice with nothing but their own quiet dignity as armor. The newly established Thompson Foundation Scholarship Program announced its first class of recipients on the 1-year anniversary of that infamous whiskey spill. 50 brilliant, ambitious young people of color would be attending the University of Chicago's Business School, with their full tuition and living expenses covered by the very money that had once funded the Rhodes family's discriminatory empire. Each scholarship award bore a small engraved plaque. "In memory of all those who suffered in silence, and in honor of all those who will now speak truth to power." Sterling Rhodes IV's final, pathetic humiliation came not in a federal courtroom, but in the sterile, impersonal employment office of a mid-tier consulting firm, where, at the age of 58, he applied for an entry-level analyst position. The young black woman conducting his interview, a recent MBA graduate from Northwestern whose own grandfather had cleaned toilets in the very same building where Sterling once held his board meetings, asked him to explain the significant gap in his employment history, with the polite, professional courtesy one reserves for former convicts and disgraced public figures. "I was involved in some legal complications," he mumbled, his voice carrying none of the imperial, room-silencing authority that had once crushed careers and ruined lives. The profound, cosmic irony of the situation was completely lost on him, but not on the universe, which, every once in a while, remembers to balance its scales. The auction of the Rhodes family estate, a sprawling, obscene mansion on the shores of Lake Michigan, drew crowds of reporters, photographers, and curious onlookers. They all watched as Alani Thompson, in a final, decisive act, outbid a consortium of real estate developers and hedge fund managers for the property. But instead of occupying the marble palace where generations of privilege had once plotted to maintain their stranglehold on power, she immediately announced that she was donating it. It would be transformed into the Thompson Community Center for Innovation and Entrepreneurship, a place where young, aspiring entrepreneurs of color would receive free business training, legal assistance, and access to the kind of powerful networks that had once been reserved exclusively for white men with the right last names and the right prep school connections. The final scene of this incredible saga writes itself with a poetic justice that would make Shakespeare weep with envy. Maria Flores, now 6 months into her tenure as CEO of Flores Industrial Solutions, stands in the executive elevator that once carried her up to her own humiliation and now lifts her and her newfound authority to heights she had never imagined possible. The same gilded cage where she once trembled at the prospect of serving coffee to men who never learned her name now carries her to board meetings where her voice shapes policy, her decisions protect workers, and her very presence proves that power, when wielded with conscience and courage, can heal wounds that once seemed permanent. And what did you think was the most satisfying moment of their downfall? Was it the boardroom takedown? The perp walk? Let me know your favorite part in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories where the powerful finally get exactly what they deserve. Until next time, remember that justice isn't just some abstract concept. It's a choice, it's an action, and sometimes it's the most powerful weapon of all.